I am 99 years old, and every April I sit at this kitchen table with a pencil and a calculator, and I do my taxes by hand. People think I'm stubborn. My grandson says there's software for this. I know there's software. I just like the math. I've always liked the math. But there's something in my desk drawer. Underneath the tax folder, underneath 50 years of returns, there's a piece of folded cardboard. Yellow now. Stained. Got a coffee ring on it from a morning in France that I think about more than I should. It's a firing table. A graphical chart with ballistic curves and printed numbers and little pencil corrections I made myself. On the morning of July 25th, 1944, I used this chart to calculate the trajectories for what the Army later called the most devastating artillery strike in the history of warfare. I didn't fire a single gun that day. I didn't pull a trigger. I didn't see a single enemy soldier. I just did the math. And 5,000 men were in the target zone when the math was done. Let me tell you how a 22-year-old accountant from Dayton, Ohio, ended up holding a slide rule in a tent in Normandy, deciding when hundreds of shells would leave hundreds of guns, so they'd all land on the same piece of dirt at the same second. I worked for a firm in Dayton before the war, Linden and Associates, my father's name on the door. I balanced books. I reconciled ledgers. I was good at it. Numbers made sense to me. You put them in the right column. You carry the right decimal. Everything adds up. Everything is clean. When I got drafted, they didn't put a rifle in my hands. They saw my test scores and sent me to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, artillery school, not to fire guns, to calculate where the shells would go. They put me in something called a fire direction center. Now people picture artillery as a man looking through binoculars and yelling fire. That's how the Germans did it. One observer, one or two batteries, adjust after the first shot. Slow, predictable. The FDC was different. It was a computing center. Trained personnel with slide rules and plotting boards and firing tables. We could calculate fire solutions for dozens of batteries simultaneously. One forward observer on a hilltop with a radio could call in fire from an entire corps through us. Not one gun, hundreds. But before I explain what we built, you need to understand what we started with. Because in 1943, American artillery was a joke. Kasserine Pass, February 1943. I was there. My first time hearing German guns. Our batteries were scattered. No coordination. No central control. The Germans rolled through us like we were training dummies. Their artillery was precise, fast, devastating. Ours was slow and confused. We couldn't talk to each other. We couldn't combine our fire. Each battery was an island. The Germans called us amateurs with good equipment. they were right. In February of 43, they were absolutely right. But here's what the Germans never understood about Americans. When we fail, we don't just try harder. We redesign the system. By June of 1944, we had 4 things the Germans didn't. First, the fire direction centers. Not one man with a map. A whole system that could coordinate dozens of batteries from a single calculation point. Second, communications. We laid telephone wire with an obsession that bordered on insanity. A single infantry division could lay 5,000 kilometers of wire in a month, plus radios as backup. And when the radios failed, we had more wire. Redundancy on top of redundancy. When German communications broke, and they broke constantly, their officers lost control. When ours broke, we switched to the backup line, and then the one after that. Third, standardization. This is the one people don't understand. Every 105 millimeter shell produced at a factory in Pennsylvania had identical ballistic characteristics to a shell from California. Identical. We could calculate trajectory accurate to the second because every round behaved the same way. German ammunition by 1944 was being made by slave labor in scattered workshops. Quality varied wildly. Sabotage was common. At Anzio, 70% of their 170 millimeter shells were duds. 70%. They had to re-zero their guns with every new batch because they couldn't trust the shells to fly the same way twice. And fourth, the thing that changed everything, time on target. Here's how it works, and I need you to understand this because it's the difference between a warning and an execution. Say you have 20 batteries, different guns, different distances from the target. A 105 millimeter shell flies for 23 seconds. A 155 from farther back, 31 seconds. A 240 millimeter monster from even farther, maybe 45 seconds. You calculate the flight time for each battery. You work backwards. You give the command to fire in reverse order. Farthest guns first, then the closer ones. Timed so precisely that every shell from every gun arrives on the target in the same second. Not the same minute, the same second. Traditional bombardment is a warning. The first shell lands. Soldiers hear it. They take cover. The rest of the shells fall on empty foxholes. Studies showed that after 8 seconds, every soldier on a battlefield is in cover. After the first explosion, casualties drop by 2/3. Time on target doesn't give you 8 seconds. It doesn't give you 2 seconds. There is no first shell. There are only all the shells at once. While 58% of men are still standing at full height, before a single brain can send the signal to a single pair of legs to move. That's not a bombardment. That's arithmetic applied to killing. July 25th, 1944, Operation Cobra. I'm in the FDC. a tent behind the lines. The largest artillery concentration the American Army had ever assembled in Europe. 1,100 guns, from 105 millimeter howitzers to 240 millimeter monsters that shook the ground when they fired even from a mile away. 170,000 shells allocated. The target, a rectangle 6.5 kilometers wide and 2.3 kilometers deep, south of the Saint-Lô-Perrière Road. Inside that rectangle, Panzer Lehr Division, the Wehrmacht's elite, their finest training tank division, veterans of Africa and the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad, 5,000 soldiers in fortified positions with 45 armored vehicles. First came the bombers, 1,500 B-17s and B-24s, 3,300 tons of bombs, 60,000 incendiary devices. The ground shook so hard that coffee slopped out of my cup onto the firing table. That's where the stain comes from. I've never cleaned it. And then the command came through. 09:38 hours. Time on target. Execute. My pencil moved across this chart. Flight times calculated. Corrections applied. Timings relayed. The batteries opened up in sequence. The big 240s first, then the 155s, then the 105s. Each one timed to the fraction of a second. And then silence from our end. Just the sound of shells in the air. A sound you can't describe. Like fabric tearing, but the fabric is the sky. Then the forward observers reported in, and I will never forget what came through that radio. Lunar landscape, craters touching at the edges, tanks overturned and buried in dirt, infantry positions leveled, roads gone, every landmark erased, men running in the open, not running away from anything, just running, insane, their minds broken. Their commander, a general named Bayerlein, said later that the shock effect was indescribable, that several of his men went insane and ran in the open until they were cut down, that more than 70% of his troops were killed, wounded, or driven mad in a single day. Panzer Lehr Division, the finest unit the German army had, ceased to exist. I heard all of this through a radio speaker while sitting at a folding table with a pencil in my hand and coffee on my chart. That's the thing nobody tells you about modern war. You can end 5,000 men from a tent with math. We didn't stop. The system worked, so we kept using it. Mortain, August 7th. Hitler ordered 4 panzer divisions to counterattack. Break through to Avranches, cut off Patton, Germany's last chance in Normandy. But on Hill 317, American observers with radios called in TOT missions all night. 7 battalions of coordinated fire on every road, every assembly area, every command post. German survivors described solid walls of red-hot steel. By dawn, the offensive was dead. 700 Americans on that hill stopped 4 panzer divisions, not because they were braver, because they had a radio and a system, the Falaise pocket. The Germans tried to retreat through a narrow corridor. Our observers were on every hill, TOT every 30 minutes throughout daylight hours. The road became known as the corridor of death. Wrecked vehicles, dead horses, abandoned equipment, traffic jams that made the next columns even more vulnerable. 50,000 captured, 10,000 killed. Artillery the main cause. Then the Ardennes, December 44, Hitler's last gamble. And we had something new, the proximity fuse, a shell that detonated at the perfect height above the ground, 6 to 15 meters up, raining shrapnel straight down into foxholes and trenches. No cover worked against it. When we added proximity fuses to TOT, lethality went through the roof. Patton wrote that the new shell with the funny fuse decided the Battle of Belgium. We caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer River. 702 men, practically annihilated. German soldiers started refusing to leave their bunkers during barrages, not from cowardice, from rational math. The chances of surviving TOT with proximity fuses were virtually zero. And here's what broke them for good. It wasn't their bodies. It was their minds. Veterans who had endured hour-long Soviet barrages on the Eastern Front, men who'd survived Stalingrad, broke after 30 seconds of TOT, because traditional bombardment has a rhythm, a pattern. Your brain has time to switch into survival mode. TOT has nothing, just silence, then everything, all at once. German hospitals documented symptoms they'd never seen before. Paralysis triggered by sudden sounds, inability to process multiple things happening at once, deep fear of synchronicity itself. The Germans understood the math. They could calculate flight times, but they couldn't build the system. Their ammunition was unpredictable. Their communications failed. Their best attempt at coordinated fire had a 12-second spread. Our standard was plus or minus 3. That's not a gap in technique. That's a gap in civilization. I came home in 45, went back to Dayton, went back to the firm, same desk, same pencil, different numbers. Every April I sit at this table and I do the math. And every April I open that drawer and I see the chart underneath the tax returns, numbers on top of numbers. People think wars are won by brave men with rifles. They're not wrong. But brave men died equally on both sides. What decided it was a system. Identical shells from identical factories. Thousands of trained specialists working to the same standard. Millions of miles of wire. And a piece of cardboard that could synchronize 1,000 guns into a single second. I'm telling you this, you, whoever's listening, because the lesson isn't about war. It's about everything. Whatever you're building, whatever problem you're trying to solve. Individual effort matters, talent matters, courage matters, but systems win every time. Organization defeats talent, coordination defeats courage, and the person who figures out how to make 20 different things arrive at the same point at the same time, that person changes history. I was an accountant before the war, during the war, after the war. I balanced books my whole life. The only difference is what I counted.